Chapter 1. My father lived the almost perfect lifespan. Playing it like a game, if you had 80 years to live, when would you like it to be? My answer would be to have lived the 80 years that ended the day after the moon landing in 1969. Perfect. As a show business brat, I grew up listening to tales of vaudeville, the Palace, the minstrel shows, Al Jolson. According to George Burns, my dad and everyone else who had been there, Jolson was the greatest entertainer who ever lived. I would kill to have seen him in person in blackface. Eddie Cantor, who also sang in blackface, said whenever he was playing in New York at the same time as Jolson, he couldn't go to see Jolson because he couldn't then do his own act. I would love to have been around for all the incredible beginnings, inventions, advances, transitions, from the horseless carriage to automobiles, from the Wright brothers to the F-15, from crystal sets to television, and on and on. How wonderful to have been in New York during the Roaring Twenties with the speakeasies, the Charleston, the whole crazy lifestyle. I always loved to hear my parents reminisce about their years on the road and in New York. The colorful Jimmy Walker was the mayor, nightclubs were thriving, and Broadway was represented by such talents as Helen Hayes, the Lunts, the Barrymores, Fanny Brice, Ethel Merman, Ed Wynn, Cole Porter, Jerome Kern, the Gershwins, Rodgers and Hart, in addition to Jolson and Cantor. All that talent, all at one time, in any single season during the late 1920s and early 1930s. Can you imagine the incredible evenings when they got together at someone's apartment for a party, entertaining and trying out new material for their friends? Can you imagine sitting around the living room listening to George Burns tell jokes, Jolson sing, Gershwin play the piano with Merman belting his latest song? I would give anything to have been there, but I wasn't, not quite yet. And since my life with Daddy didn't begin until he was 40 years old, let's go back to the real beginning of his life. Here it is in his own words, from that fortunately discovered manuscript. There are a few things you should know in advance. In the first place, I was not born in Waukegan. I was born at the Mercy Hospital in Chicago on Valentine's Day, 1894. My parents lived in Waukegan, but my mother insisted on giving birth in Chicago. She believed it was an honor to be born in a big city. When people ask my son where he was born, I want him to say he was born in Chicago, she told her friends. And she dreamed with all her heart and soul that her son should be a famous concert violinist. In the second place, I should warn you, in advance, that if you are expecting my book to be like other show business autobiographies, you're likely to be disappointed. I did not triumph over adversity. I did not go through struggles and hardships. My only handicap is golf. I always had shoes and warm clothes. I come from a conventional, warm-hearted Jewish family. My father, Meyer Kubelski, was a hard-working immigrant, and his wife Emma was an ordinary housewife who was a genius at baking a cake or making cookies. From eating my mother's pastry, I developed a desire for sweets that has plagued me all my life. I never had a problem with narcotics or drugs, and I am at most a moderate drinker. My sex life was not lacking, but certainly it was nothing sensational to write about. I love my wife. She is the only one I've ever had, and we've been together for 45 years as I write this in 1972. Had I known, as a young man, that some day I would want to write my autobiography, I assure you that I would have gone out of my way to have at least 2 or 3 great love affairs. I have had a few hair-raising adventures. It is true that once in Stuttgart I was shot at, but the man missed me completely. I didn't even get a flesh wound, so there goes that heroic enterprise. In the third place, I must disillusion you further. I'm not really a cheapskate. Once, many years ago, in the Moulin Rouge, a Hollywood nightclub, where the standard tip was a quarter, I tipped the hat check girl $1. She returned it. "Please, Mr. Benny," she said, "leave me with some illusions." And finally, you should know that I am not really 39. In the early years of this century, Waukegan citizens with sensitive ears avoided the vicinity of 224 South Genesee Street between 4 and 6 o'clock in the afternoon. These were the hours when I, Benjamin Kubelski, practiced the violin. I loved the violin, but I hated practicing. I especially hated scales, but the worst were the Kreutzer exercises, which are a series of hundreds of exercises based on the scales, running up and down the 4-octave range of the violin. I practiced in the front parlor of our second-floor apartment on South Genesee, the poor end of Genesee. North Genesee was the fancy Genesee. If I looked out the window, I could see Papa's haberdashery store across the street, and beyond that, Lake Michigan. When Mama went over to help in the store, I stopped practicing. I'd watch the boats. I'd watch the people by the docks. I'd fall into a trance and dream of running away to far-off countries. I would try to keep an eye out for Mama crossing the street. She was a tall, slender, beautiful woman with sad blue eyes and long dark hair. Usually, she was sweet and gentle and patient. Sometimes, seemingly for no reason, she would fall into a depression and be bitter for days, and sometimes she would get violently angry. I often aroused her anger. I would get so dreamy that I would forget to watch out for Mama returning home to make supper. She'd come into the parlor and see me with the fiddle on my lap and the bow hanging down on the floor. "Benny, what are you doing?" "I don't know, Ma." "Why ain't you practicing?" "I'd finished already," I lied. "It's only 5 o'clock." "I don't want to practice. I don't want to be a musician. I can't help it, Mama," I said, sighing. "Look at Misha Elman. He's your age, and already he's famous. All over the world people know about Misha Elman. And why? From working hard, from sticking. You got a talent like a Misha Elman, only you must practice to bring it out." "Yes, Mama." She went into the kitchen and put a few sticks of kindling on the coal in the coal-burning oven to start the fire for supper. I played another set of Kreutzer exercises. You had to play each one 10 times before going on to the next one. When I shifted them from one position to another, the fingers of my left hand began to hurt. As I resumed practicing, I cursed Misha Elman, who was only 3 years older than I, but had become rich and famous and had even played for the Tsar of Russia. Even before Misha Elman, even before I was born, my mother dreamed of my becoming a musician. She loved music and played our battered old upright piano in the parlor. She always played on Sunday, and I was fascinated by her music. When I was 3 or 4, I began trying to copy her. Apparently, one day I actually picked out a minuet I had heard Mama play, note for note. Mama cried with happiness. She taught me the fingering of the C major scale, and I learned how to play nursery rhyme melodies with both hands. I was happy playing the piano. Then along came Elman, and I was switched to the violin. My father laid out $100, a huge sum of money for him at the time, for a half-size fiddle. My first teacher charged 50 cents a lesson. Then came Professor Lindsay, the best music teacher in Waukegan, who charged $1 a lesson. 2 years later, Lindsay convinced my parents that I should study with Dr. Hugo Kortschalk. He taught at the Chicago Musical College and later founded the Berkshire String Quartet. He did not take many pupils, but thought I had real talent, and said he would take me on at $15 a lesson if I agreed to practice for 2 hours a day. This was something of a hardship for my parents, but that didn't matter to them. Meyer Kubelski thought 2 hours of work a day was a cinch. Papa came over in one of the earliest waves of Eastern European immigration, from a ghetto village near the Polish border. This was not the kind of labor that he would call work. Much as I hated practicing violin, I hated school and homework even more. Mama and Papa, I'm afraid, looked on me as a total failure, a hopeless case. I was inclined to agree with them. There wasn't any subject I was interested in. I wasn't even crazy about sports. I played football and basketball. I was fast on my feet and had good eyesight and coordination. and I could have been a professional ball player. In fact, I played for one season with a semi-pro team, and our pitcher was Bob O'Farrell, who later played in the major leagues. We played other teams for a few dollars a man, but you have to care very much about anything, be it football or violin, to make good. And I just didn't care. When I got to puberty, I became very interested in girls, and very much enjoyed what we then called spooning. But even this I didn't make into a big thing, as did some of my friends who couldn't get sex and girls and art poses, the latter smuggled in from Chicago at great expense and handed around, off the brain. They would brag about taking girls for walks in the unpopulated areas of Waukegan and what they did with them. I thought vaguely that it might be interesting to do this myself, but then when I thought of having to get up my nerve and persuade the girls and all the trouble of taking them for a long walk, well, it just seemed entirely too much for me. I played truant from school as often as I could. Mama was called in to get reports of my bad conduct. I talked in class, I made jokes, I broke people up. I was sent to the principal's office so many times I became part of the furniture there. But I didn't even work hard at being a juvenile delinquent. I didn't break windows or unhitch horses from carriages, and I certainly didn't steal. I was a dreamer. I couldn't concentrate. I was bad in every subject: English, history, geography, arithmetic, civics. I was only graduated from public school because the principal wanted to get rid of me and let the high school worry about me. I attended Central High School for one term, at the end of which the principal, Mr. Stebbins, informed my father that I was flunking every course. My father hired a private tutor to help me pass the final examinations. I failed them all. At last Mr. Stebbins summoned me to his office. "Benjamin Kibelski," he said, like a judge pronouncing sentence, "we have no place in the school for people like you. It would be better if you left. But I want you to know that forgiveness is part of our philosophy here at Central. If you mend your ways and are prepared to buckle down, we will open our doors to you in the future. I know you are not a fool. Education is a key that opens many doors. I hope you will think this over." I didn't. I was in 107th heaven. After I was thrown out of high school, I was also cut off by Dr. Kortschalk. He told Papa if I wouldn't practice, he did not want to teach me any longer. Next, Papa sent me to a local business school. I took to bookkeeping and accounting like a fish takes to land. Before you could say double entry, I was kicked out of the Waukegan Business College. As a last resort, Papa said he would teach me the haberdashery business. This was one of the least exciting propositions ever made to me, but what could I do? I was fit for nothing. So I went to work for him. Mornings I opened the store and swept the sidewalk. I pulled up the shades and straightened the merchandise. In winter I put coal in the banked stove to heat the place. Papa taught me how the stock was priced, how to keep the books, and how to enter payments of his debtors. He sold a lot on credit. Saturday was payday in Waukegan. One Saturday, Papa was in the back of the store where there were full-length mirrors, fitting a customer with a heavy overcoat. I was at the cash register when a customer took in. He handed me $1. I took it. "It's on my account," he said. "Thank you," I said as he departed. "What did you sell, Benny?" Papa yelled out. "Nothing. Some man just came in and handed me $1 on his account." "So what was his name?" "Do you have to know their names?" I asked. "Dear God," my father said, looking up at the ceiling toward heaven above, "tell me, what did I do so terrible to deserve this?" A couple of similar instances convinced Papa I would never be a businessman, and he asked me not to help out in the store anymore. There is a saying that coming events cast their shadows before them. My parents and I saw the shadows, and not the events. I'm told that when I was 3 years old, I liked to get a smile out of people by reciting poems and singing nursery rhymes. My best audience was Grandma Sachs and Papa's sister, Aunt Clara. I would collect all the chairs and put them in rows in the parlor. Then I would put on a little show. Sometimes I played the piano, and later, when I was learning to play the fiddle, I added a few violin solos. When I was 8 years old, I performed at the Saturday children's matinees at the Phoenix Opera House. I would be dressed in velvet knickerbockers, a white silk shirt, and a black Windsor tie. Grandma thought I was adorable. At one concert, I played a medley of Stephen Foster songs with piano accompaniment. "You should be proud of Benny," Grandma said. "You don't practice," Mama said. "Without practicing, he'll be a nothing." "You'll see," Grandma prophesied. "What'll I see? From this he's making a living? Old Black Joe, way down upon a river? This is music? He ain't fit to carry Misha Elman's Rosin." "You'll see," was Grandma's answer. "I should live so long," Mama would say, sighing. Poor Mama, she didn't live so long. She died of cancer in 1917, when she was 47 and I was 23. In the meantime, I was a bitter disappointment, a cheap fiddle act in vaudeville, and she never came to see me because she thought show business was immoral. At 17, I was playing in the pit orchestra of one of the two vaudeville theaters in Waukegan, the Barrison, making $7.50 a week. I was learning about show business through osmosis. One week in 1911, the Marx Brothers came to town. They were then billed as the Marx Brothers, Marks, and used their real names, Arthur, Julius, Herbert, and Leonard. Harpo, Groucho, Zeppo, and Chico came later. Their mother, Minnie Palmer, who had a sharp sense of show business values, ran the act. At the Monday rehearsals, when we were given the music for the musical acts, Mrs. Marks watched me pick up the notes fast, and she saw how well I played their act. Like all vaudeville acts that had any music, they carried around their own orchestrations in combinations of 4, 6, or 8, or 12 instruments, up to a full orchestra for the big theaters in the big cities. Minnie talked to me after rehearsal one day. She was impressed by my playing and sight reading, and offered me $15 a week plus transportation and room and board to travel with her young sons. She wanted me to play the violin for their act and conduct the pit bands. If I had gone on the road then, I might have become so successful as a pit musician that I never would have become a comedian. Actually, I wasn't thinking about becoming a comedian. It was the furthest thing from my mind. But I did think how nice it would be to be a straight man in a comedy team, because the straight man wore good clothes and carried a cane and a straw hat. I accepted Minnie's offer. My parents turned it down flat. They wouldn't even discuss it. Then suddenly, 1 year later, the Barrison closed. Cora Salisbury, a lively, intelligent woman who had earlier taken me under her wing, decided to go back to work. She had previously played piano in a vaudeville act and was recently widowed. She was a motherly type with an enormous coiffure of black hair and an even more enormous bust. In fact, at 45, she was a couple of years older than my mother. She asked if I would join her in a piano-violin act, strictly music, no patter. Again, I went to my parents, but with a difference. I was now 18. Still, they thought I was ruining my life forever. Mama cried, "We didn't give you music lessons, so you should make a disgrace of yourself." "But it's a chance to make something of myself," I said. "I have a big future. I'll be making $20 a week, and Mrs. Salisbury says I'm good enough to be making $50 or maybe more someday. It's the chance of a lifetime." "The people in the theater are rotten human beings," Papa shouted. "They got no morals. They got no decency. If you go on the stage, don't come home no more. You ain't got no home as far as I'm concerned. Permission you want? For what? To ruin your life? I seen plenty of these actors. They don't know from religion. They don't sleep or eat regular. They're good for nothing. And the women, hoo-ha! They're worse than the men. In front of Mama, I can't tell you my honest opinion of such women. They paint their faces and smoke cigarettes and curse. Such things you wouldn't believe." I pleaded, but they were stubborn. Finally, I said that if I was compelled to make a choice, I would remain at home, but I asked one favor, that they talk to Mrs. Salisbury and let her explain about vaudeville. Mama weakened, not Papa. Mama spent an afternoon having a heart-to-heart talk with Mrs. Salisbury. It was obvious from the way Cora dressed, looked, and spoke that she was a decent, respectable lady. She promised Mama that she would take care of me, see that I lived in respectable boarding houses, ate kosher meals, and got plenty of sleep. She promised to guard me from the loose actresses, who, my parents were convinced, were lounging around in hundreds of theaters, waiting for the chance to seduce their son. Mrs. Salisbury coaxed Mama around to the idea that a son with such basic integrity couldn't be corrupted. Then Mama got to work on Papa, and coaxed him into giving his consent to a trial period of 3 months. So one morning in September 1912, with my violin case in one hand and my satchel in the other, I boarded a train with Cora for Gary, Indiana, where we had a 3-day booking at the Majestic Theater. We were in the second spot, opening with a rousing rendition of The Poet and Peasant Overture, and closing it with a fast version of Everybody's Doing It, Doing What? Turkey trot, turkey trot. Cora would hit a series of thundering chords with her left hand, and fantastic arpeggios with her right, while I was doing crazy runs up and down 3 octaves. We were killing the audiences, I can tell you. They thought I was doing something impossible. As time went on, I began to pantomime to suggest the terrible struggle I had in playing these numbers. Later, when we added a big solo for me, the Rosary, for which I was given an amber spotlight, I looked poetic and would play with the pinky finger of my bow hand extended delicately. Actually, though I didn't know it, I was an actor playing the role of a violinist. I looked and acted more like a violinist than a real violinist did. We were what they called a class act. Cora wore a blue velvet gown, rhinestone earrings, and a rhinestone tiara. I was decked out in a tuxedo, stiff shirt, and bow tie. Papa, in a gesture of reconciliation, had taken this finery out of his stock and presented it to me as a going-away present. A few weeks after we were on the road, I had quite a jolt. The concert violinist, Jan Kubelik, was giving concerts in the Midwest, and he had heard about me. His lawyer told me that I would be sued unless I changed my name. He said I was deliberately misleading the public by using the name Kubelski and playing the violin. I told him that Kubelski was my real name, but they didn't believe me. So I became Ben Benny, and the act became Salisbury and Benny. A few years later, when I was doing a single, playing the violin and adding some comedy, Ben Burney was also doing a talking and fiddle act, and had been doing it for many years. Again, another lawyer said they would sue. So, once more, I changed my name, this time to Jack Benny. Why Jack? This happened shortly after World War I. My good friend Benny Rubin, who was also in vaudeville, was having dinner with me when 2 sailors came over to our table. In those days, all sailors called each other Jack. "Hello, Jack," said one of them. "Didn't we meet you at the Great Lakes Naval Station? Weren't you in the show there?" "Yes, Jack," I answered, "I was." We reminisced about the Navy. They kept calling me Jack, and I kept calling them Jack. When we went outside, Benny Rubin yelled, "That's your name." "What name?" "Jack, I like it. Jack Benny." Cora and I played theaters scattered throughout the Midwest. We played split weeks, 3 days here, 3 days there, a Sunday someplace else. I spent many lonely hours in railway stations in the middle of the night, waiting for a milk train to take me to the next town. No, I don't look back with nostalgia on those first 2 seasons in vaudeville. It was hard work. It was a constant getting on a train, getting off a train, carrying your bags to the cheapest hotel or boarding house, running to the theater, playing 3, 4, 5 shows a day, smiling when you faced the audience, taking your bow and fighting all the time for a better place on the bill. The best position was next to closing. In spite of Cora's promise to my mother, I didn't get much sleep during that time. But I learned how to sleep on the wooden benches of railroad stations, on dusty coaches, and backstage in a dressing room that was usually shared with the male members of the other acts. At the end of the second season, Cora's mother became seriously ill, and she had to return to Waukegan. I went to Chicago to find a replacement. He was a young pianist named Lyman Woods. Tall and handsome, with a narrow mustache, he looked very distinguished. He couldn't read music, but he was a natural. He could learn a new number after hearing it only once. We called the act From Grand Opera to Ragtime, and now I got top billing. It was Benny and Woods. I changed the spelling from Y to IE because I thought IE had more class. That didn't last long. We opened as before with the good old Poet and Peasant Overture, and after playing a few bars of it straight, we did it in ragtime. Then Woods did a melody of Brahms' Hungarian Dance and a Chopin Nocturne, playing as if he were Paderewski. Then I did the Rosary. I played it in the amber spotlight, then got a white spot and went into a fast new number. When Ragtime Rosie ragged the Rosary. Audiences for which we played hadn't heard this variation, and it slayed them. Then we sagged into a melody of currently popular ballads like You Made Me Love You, I Didn't Want to Do It, and finished with some ragtime hits. When we came out to take our bows, Lyman was also holding a fiddle, and the two of us did a smattering of Alexander's Ragtime Band, with Lyman making a mess of his fiddle playing. We usually exited to laughter and applause. The act was still straight violin and piano, but we had started to put humor in our music. Lyman was naturally amusing, and I was learning to get laughs by playing my fiddle in funny ways and with gestures. We still didn't speak a single word. Soon the act was playing the better theater circuits, and we were getting $3.50 a week as a team. We were even playing major cities. As I've said, I fancied myself something of a dandy, and most of my salary went for the high life. I wore snappy two-toned shoes, high-class suits, a diamond ring, and a diamond stickpin. I was a real big shot, a spender. Lyman and I worked together for 5 years. In 1917, our agent decided we were ready to play the Palace Theater in New York. The Palace was the mecca of vaudeville. Playing the Palace meant you had made it. We played the Palace and fell flat on our faces. Variety gave us only a few lines. Had we gone over big, we would have received half a column. We were never able to figure out what had gone wrong. Maybe our songs were stale, or we just weren't sophisticated enough for New York. We never found out. With all the fuss about changing my name, it seemed pretty silly that when I enlisted in the Navy, I became Benjamin Kubelski all over again. I didn't choose the Navy because I loved the sea. It was a geographical accident. In 1917, the government established a base near Waukegan, the Great Lakes Naval Training Station. I not only owe my first name to the United States Navy, but it was on account of the Navy that I became a comedian. If I hadn't been a sailor at Great Lakes, I wouldn't have been cast in a show they put on. I might never have learned to speak on stage. I didn't mind cracking wise with my fellow vaudeville troopers backstage or in a cafe, but on stage I couldn't open my mouth. At the mere thought of speaking, I got the shakes. It took me years to get over my stage fright, and I never did completely. Furthermore, if an Irishman, later to be known in movies as Pat O'Brien, had not also been at boot camp, I might have refused to be a comedian in the Navy show. The first 3 months at Great Lakes, I went through the usual boot camp training of marching, drilling, and learning all the nautical procedures. We marched, not in all kinds of weather, but certainly in the two kinds on the shores of Lake Michigan that year, sleet and snow. I was not wild about it, but I obeyed orders. I didn't have much choice. Meanwhile, the sailors who had been in show business before the war began putting on impromptu shows in the recreation hall on Saturday nights. Naturally, I took part with my fiddle. One evening I made the mistake of playing the Rosary straight. You never heard such booing. Pat O'Brien, who was waiting in the wings to do a dramatic sketch, noticed my embarrassment and came on stage. This looked prearranged to the sailors. Pat whispered in my ear while I continued playing as though it was perfectly normal. What he whispered was, "For heaven's sake, Ben, put down the damn fiddle and talk to him." Then Pat stood there with his hands on his hips, grinning. "Fellows," I desperately ad-libbed to the audience, "I was having an argument with Pat O'Brien this morning." I paused because, not of any great sense of timing, but because I couldn't think of what to say next. "Yeah, this morning, with Pat O'Brien, an argument about the Irish Navy." From out front, sweet sounds of laughter came to my ears. "You see," I went on, "I claim the Swiss Navy is bigger than the Irish Navy, and the Jewish Navy is bigger than both of them put together." This brought down the house. My next line, as I remember it, was, "I've heard you sailors complain about the food." They groaned in agreement. "Well, I want to tell you that the enlisted men get the same food as Captain Moffat gets." I paused, on purpose this time, "only his is cooked." Now and then, when I marched with a gun on my shoulder and wanted to forget my tight boots, I thought about why the sailors preferred to laugh at these jokes instead of being uplifted by my interpretation of the rosary. One morning at rehearsal for a show to raise money for the Navy Relief Fund, they needed someone to read 2 lines in a sketch. The director pointed to me. It was just one of those things. It could have been anybody. I read the lines in my flat Midwestern tone. Because the other actors were overplaying their parts, my slow, flat delivery sounded funny in contrast. Every day I kept getting more and more lines. I played Is He There?, the Admiral's Disorderly. By the time we opened in Chicago, I was the comedy hit of the show. After 2 smash weeks, we went on a tour of the biggest Midwestern cities, closing at last in Waukegan in December 1918. After the armistice, I decided to go back to vaudeville all alone. It was a difficult step to take. To do a single, I would have to talk as well as play the fiddle. Where would I get the words? I wasn't rich enough to buy an act from a professional gag writer, so I had to make one up myself. I figured out a few jokes. I borrowed some, I stole some. My new act was Ben K. Benny, fiddle phonology. I worked on it in front of a mirror by myself for 2 weeks. I paced it, I timed it, I chose the numbers. I tried it on a couple of cronies, and when I felt I was ready, I went out on the Western vaudeville circuit. I opened with the good old Poet and Peasant in ragtime. I told a few jokes. I played a few of the new hits. I also sang, in a rough baritone voice. One thing you could say about my singing, I was loud. In Chicago, I bought 2 special numbers. One was about the coming of Prohibition. After this country goes dry, goodbye, wild women, goodbye. My other aria was a tender romantic ballad entitled, I Used to Call Her Baby, But Now She's a Mother to Me. It was a variation on Oedipus Rex. It worked. Everywhere I went, I heard the sweet sounds of laughter and applause. I was still slotted in the second place, the deuce spot, but I soon was getting better placements and more money. By 1921, I had drastically changed my act. I didn't sing. I didn't play the violin except at the close of the act when I played myself off with a few bars of tiger rag. I talked, but I held the fiddle all through the act, the fiddle in the left hand and the bow in the right. I was still unsure of myself as a comedian, and the fiddle was my psychological crutch. Since I no longer did weird musical effects, I was no longer a fiddle phonologist. No, I called the act Jack Benny, Aristocrat of Humor. Its essence was low-key jokes about topical issues and long stories about my dumb girlfriends. All comedians had dumb girlfriends. The years went by, and I was playing the best theaters and getting a good salary, $350 a week and $450 on the road, which was the best money I ever made in vaudeville. You had to be a Harry Lauder or a Sarah Bernhardt to get the fabulous salaries of $5,000 a week or more. And yet I was a headliner in a way. That is to say, now I was playing in the next to closing spot, and I received prominent billing on the marquee. But I was not a star. I did not, indeed, become a star until I went on the radio. It's the end of Chapter 1. More to come, and thank you for listening to that. And like and subscribe and comment, unless you don't want to.